Good day and welcome to today's discussion on youth, student and reparations, being brought to you through the National Television Network on behalf of the Cultural Development Foundation, the National Youth Council, National Students Council, National Reparations Committee, and other stakeholders participating in observance of Emancipation Month 2023 in St. Lucia. And today, to observe International Youth Day, August 12th, every year, observed that way, thanks to the designation by the United Nations. On August 12th, every year, the focus is on youth and students. There's also a Students' Day, but youth are also students. Students are youth, and issues affecting youth and students usually combine on both International Youth Day and International Students' Day. So today we will start our conversation, is what I would like to describe it as, with a presentation from the United Nations in terms of how the United Nations sees the theme for this year and the context within which it is taking place. That will set the stage for our discussion, which would be more by way of a conversation than a debate or an argument over pros and cons of reparations. And our panel today include Monsignor Dr. Patrick Anthony, who is in studio with us. Also with us is Mr. Ethan Leand. He is the first Vice President of the National Students Council. Also online with us is Dylan Emmanuel, the first Vice President of the St. Lucia National Youth Council, and Nkrumah Lucia, lecturer at the St. Mary's College, who is also a founding member of the NRC and the point person over the last decade on the NRC for youth. Welcome everyone. I'm Earl Buski, the chair of the NRC and the host of today's conversation. So to start off, we will join Mr. Ahmad Al-Bendawi. Ahmad Al-Bendawi. He is the United Nations Secretary General's envoy on youth, and he will speak to us today about youth engagement being essential for sustainable development. Mr. Ahmed Al-Bendawi.
Here in the history of the United Nations, a year where we're adopting a new sustainable development goals, a very bold promise for the future. We celebrate this International Youth Day with the theme of youth civic engagement. Civic engagement is about feeling the responsibility of honoring the social contract in your society and also being part of doing something good for your community and making sure that you are not only a beneficiary but also you're a player and making change in the world. It's from political participation to volunteering to community work to cultural activities. It's all of that for young people who are already engaged. So we are proud of you. We salute your important work and we need you even to do more. To governments, that we need to scale up our investments in young people. We need to channel more resources and we need to open more mechanisms for young people to be involved in the decision-making processes. That's a guarantee to achieve development and to foster economic prosperity for everyone. I'd invite them all to come on board with the United Nations and to be part of this global movement. We have a very exciting time and we need everybody to come on board. Some of them, they would say, I am too small and these issues are too big. I can't make a difference. And my answer is nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And we can be the generation that, as the Secretary General said, we eradicate extreme poverty in 15 years. Things can't be more exciting than that.
And that was Mr. Ahmed Al-Bedawi, the United Nations Secretary General's envoy on youth. And like I said, his message was mainly directed at governments, but as we all heard, he made one point that is important to us all. Not everybody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And it is in that respect that we can see and should see the issue of reparations being one that is not achievable only by governments, but by the collective ability of those involved to work together towards a common goal. And it is within that context that we have to see the observance of Emancipation Month for a second year in St. Lucia. And there is a third year. The third one will happen next year. But today is International Youth Day, and I'd like us to start off with Mr. Nkrumah Lucian, who is, like I said, the point person on the National Reparations Committee for Reparations, and having worked alongside Nkrumah for the last decade on reparations issues affecting youth, we've been able to see and experience the way in which over that decade it has become even more clear that the youth and the older generation have different perspectives on reparations. But his engagement is also with students, and therefore his contribution to our conversation today is one we should all look forward to. Over to you, Mr. Lucia.
All right, good morning, Lord, and good morning to all the listeners and viewers. I'll just speak briefly about our experience in terms of engaging the young persons and some of the kinds of questions that they came up with. Many of the young persons were very taken aback by the issue of reparations, something that they had not been familiar with. And of course, you would recall that many of them wondered why. Why were they not aware of reparations? Further to that, you had the fact that many of the issues around reparations, they had many questions about those things, because you would find that although students may have learned in their history classes about things like slavery, and we do know that many of our students actually are not exposed to this, because there are schools where subjects like history and literature are not taught. But when we engage them, there were questions, and I would say, Earl, that while there were differences, we know that there are some questions that do come up among both groups. Mm-hmm. For instance, in the common consciousness of our society, there are certain impressions about our history and about Africa and about enslavement. You hear terms, you hear expressions about the Africans sold themselves and these kinds of things, which perpetuate some of the negative stereotypes that we have of Africans, and make the issue of reparations a lot more difficult to discuss. But having raised those issues and the interest that the young person had in them, I do see the potential for people to become better informed and to begin to engage those issues a lot better. For instance, okay, we speak about the slave trade and who are the various stakeholders in there, which part various groups played, who benefited from it, and who was affected most and was affected in different ways. We also know that this week, in fact, we were discussing the indigenous people, and we know in many of our Caribbean islands, although these were the original inhabitants, we do not see much evidence of them in many of our islands, except for islands like Guyana, a bit in Trinidad, St. Vincent, and of course in Guyana.
Dominica.
So yes, young people, many of them not being aware, but we do see that when the issue arises, there is the interest, and also many of the issues that young persons find relevant to discuss, we have we have connections to those things in reparations. I'll just briefly mention, I remember a beautiful poem delivered by Miss Khadija Halliday, speaking about the issue of colorism. Okay, all of those kinds of things do pique the interest of the young persons and can be connected with reparations. Thank you.
Thank you, Nkrumah. And like I was saying, that we went the National Reparations Committee in the early period, 2019, 20. Sorry? Yeah, 2014. Come up. We went to schools. We tried to go to all of the 21 secondary schools around the island. We didn't get to all, but we got to most. And as Nkrumah was saying, the response from the students, Ethan, was quite different to the response we got from the communities we would go through at night. The communities would want to know when we get in pay. The students would want to know why we never knew that, why isn't it happening. And in the period between then and now, we have come to the fortunate situation where this year in 2023, on the 10th anniversary of the reparations movement, the Cambridge University and the University of the West Indies announced an annual set of scholarships for the study of reparations, either in the Caribbean or in the UK. And on that basis, to me, it opens the way for us, the reparations advocates and the student movement, to be able to agitate to make reparations a curriculum subject. What do you think?
Well, personally, when I went to school, I love history, in fact. And the whole idea of slavery and the triangular slave trade and stuff, that was a really interesting part of it. And when it comes to, okay, what I enjoy information, but what does that do for me now? How does that link to the present? There wasn't any information in that, but I guess Mr. Lucian can say that teachers don't have flexibility like that to talk about reparations and colorism and issues that still affect us today. In a sense that...
Because they're non-curriculum issues?
Yes. And I went through the curriculum again in Caribbean history, and there was no link to the future, to the tomorrow. And that's what interests you.
The history is an endangered subject at university level. UWI has launched a movement to save history, and only last year they were able to achieve the administrative measures to ensure that history remains. But history is not a choice, a natural choice of students. So why, Ethan, I mean, you pointed out, like you said, you don't see how does it apply now. Is it because you're not learning from it at school? Because today you have access of knowledge at your fingertips. Is it because it doesn't apply to you, or is it because you don't have enough room to expand your knowledge and apply what you're learning?
Well, in a sense, how most students and most young people get introduced to it is through the school. So it comes to how the teacher teaches it, the subject. That's a major, I say that could be the biggest reason why
if you have a boring teacher, you don't want to learn.
And in a sense that we don't want to really, if you're not learning, you're not finding interesting at school, you're not going to go home and research it again. So that's really like the main crux of the issue. But I enjoyed it because I started watching documentaries before I went into the classroom, on the classroom. So when it came to the classroom, I was just getting the feel of information about the specifics in the Caribbean. So I guess that came out favorable for me.
Dylan Emmanuel is the first vice president of the National Youth Council, and having heard Ethan, what can you bring to the table insofar as how you see youth responding to the whole call for reparations for slavery and native genocide?
It has been a beautiful discourse so far, and listening, especially the part with educating students on reparation and the fact that there might even be scholarship. This is not a subject for everyone, which is obvious that everybody will not want to go down this line. However, I believe that all students should be knowledgeable enough to know what reparation means. So we should bring them to, we should allow our students, or even the schools, like my young brother was saying, that we need more teachers engaged in wanting to teach that type of subject, and the way that they teach it, to bring it out, to get the students to want to learn. Because that's something we need to bring to our schools, because some students, they're visual learners. Some of them learn more by listening. So we have to find out how our students learn, and we need to find a way to bring these type of topics and make it interesting enough for them to want to learn, want to study more about it.
Yes, thank you. Monsignor Dr. Patrick Anthony is going to bring to us the perspective that comes not just with being an adult, but having gone through this same movement with many of us, and him as a pioneer in the movement to promote Creole, as a founding member, founding director of the Folk Research Center, introducing Creole to St. Lucians as an important subject, as a language, and as something to be taken seriously was as difficult as one can imagine. Papa, don't you think?
Well, as I was listening to the parallels, you know, I was feeling the parallel, because you see, and even Creole was at an even greater disadvantage, because I mean, there was a time when teachers used to beat children for speaking Creole, you know, and parents didn't want children to speak Creole at home. For two reasons. One, of course, it was parents' weapon of communication. So in other words, they wanted to say things quietly. They wanted so they use it. So it is a tool for them. In that sense, so utilitarians, they didn't want children to know it. But also there was a misconception that Creole was going to interfere with one's English. So therefore, if you want your child to develop to be a good speaking English person, then you have to get rid of Creole. So the struggle for Creole was really, really a difficult struggle. But I mean, look at where we are today. You know, I was hearing Ika on radio a while ago saying, "Hey, Scuba Sabali Creole, who knew what Creole that was you know." I said, my God, isn't that something? Listen to that today. You know, listen to that. Because we've come to the point now where people are recognizing that if you are St. Lucian and you cannot speak Creole, you're at a disadvantage. And it's not always saying that. People feel they're at a disadvantage. There's so much that's happening wrong, and they cannot enter that universe. And just think of the disservice that was done to the country all of those years, when all of those riches was somehow denied our people. So using that same parallel, let's go to our history. I mean, you cannot talk about reparation if you don't understand the history. Now, just think of the same way that knowledge or lack of knowledge of Creole deprived people of so much. Think of the lack of knowledge of history. What's depriving us of? In other words, what we have now, we have the false narrative. The only history we have is the history that's been told to us about ourselves by others, which is all, of course, their story, not our story. And then you begin to discover, my gosh, wow, African people, African history, African civilizations, my gosh. And the whole spectrum of the falsehood that Europe is all about, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, how Europe's development was based upon African resources, African intelligence, African knowledge. I mean, people don't know those things, you see. So to begin to talk about reparation, we have to go, that original knowledge must be there. And that for me is a big challenge for our students. Because our students have to come to know the history first, so that they can then see where reparation comes in. Because reparation is a consequence of the history. You know?
And in case you've just joined us, this is a conversation on reparations, youth, student, and reparations, why youth and students should engage with and be concerned about reparations. And our presenters on behalf of the National Youth Council, the National Students Council, Monsignor Anthony, and lecturer Nkrumah Lucia, have all given perspectives that have their common denominator being that if we don't know our history, then it will be difficult to understand why reparations. Similarly, if we don't understand that history, we will not understand why reparations for slavery and for native genocide. And as one of our earlier speakers pointed out, the native genocide aspect is another one that we see but don't see, from the standpoint that we may only believe that the only evidence we might have of our first people, our indigenous people, might be the bones turning up at the beaches and at the construction sites. But as I was telling Ethan earlier, the whole thing of cassava, you know, Fawin Exaboka, those are foods, staple foods that go all the way back to pre-Columbian days, and they are prepared the same way, planted the same way, and have the nutrients that always existed and which we would not know, and which is why many youth and students would prefer to opt for a KFC than for a cassava. And it is something we might just laugh at because it might be asking them to make a choice between a difference between chalk and cheese. But if they don't know, then it's not the choice is on what they prefer, and it goes with what they prefer. What do you think about that? And remember, Nkrumah and Dylan, it's a conversation, so you could join in anytime, eh?
Yes, I wanted to add something to what you were saying.
Yeah, go ahead.
You see, when it comes to learning about reparation and our culture, I think we're not making enough use of the activities or the holidays that we have here in St. Lucia to teach our youth. For example, Journée Creole activity. We have persons just walking around eating and drinking. A lot of that, to me, that is what it has become. You know, where persons just come to meet with persons and mingle. There's no education really happening where we teach our people our culture and our past. If it is happening, it's not enough, because we have people coming and persons are saying, man, Journée Creole now is similar to Asu Square on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. You know, so I think not only our schools, but in other things that we have going on the island, we can teach these things. Even through dramatization, you know, a lot of people learn that way. And these are some of the things we need to bring back more and to teach our people. If it is not happening in the school, let's just find more ways to teach our people about our culture, especially our young people.
Yeah, and Nkrumah?
Can I come in on?
Yeah.
Yes. From my perspective as a teacher, I want to also touch on the issue of education and even the idea of persons not selecting the subject. It is something that I get very often, especially at the Form 3 level when students are about to select their subjects. They often ask, so what job can that subject get me? And of course I could give them answers, you know, because history can be applied in a range of subjects, from law, even to economics, because Alpha Lewis had a very good grasp of history, even being an economist. But it also says something about our approach to education, where every subject is valued simply in terms of getting a job. and not in terms of understanding ourselves better or even understanding the things that we are studying better. For instance, you can become an accomplished scientist and have the impression that all accomplishments of science and all knowledge of those things came directly from Europe. And that's something that you may pass on and not know that even things like what we study now with algorithms and algebra, these things have their roots in the Middle East, and other aspects have their roots in Africa and these kinds of things. So it even calls for us to revisit our conception of those things, what we call education, how we approach education. And I want to also emphasize that while we are talking about the issue of reparations, examining the history is relevant every single day. It's not just a matter of the past. You do not understand what you are doing in the present without being able to fit it in the context of the past. And that is often missing, for instance, in our media, where issues are just presented as if they just happened today. And then what happened prior that contributed to it and can probably put it in a clearer light is absent in terms of the reporting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and it's all got to do with, like we said, the importance of ensuring that youth and students see reparations in all of its lights, and therefore when we look at observance of Emancipation Month, the idea was not and is not to only concentrate on Emancipation Day 30 times or Emancipation Day over a month period, but it is to examine all of the issues that surround emancipation with before slavery, during slavery, post-slavery, colonialism, up to where we are now, but also to look at the periods between slavery, abolition, emancipation, indentureship, the call for repatriation by Rastafari, and the call for reparations by CARICOM governments, which today has become an international movement. In the 10 years since CARICOM made the first call, where it was the first time 14 governments anywhere in the world, 14, not one, because in all instances of reparations, whether it is the Jews or the Japanese, etc., it is one nation or one nationality is seeking reparations. But what we had for the very first time in the history of the world was 14 governments, 14 former European colonies saying unto UK and the countries in Europe that built empires off the backs of slaves through the so-called Great Triangle, but particularly in what we learned in school as the Middle Passage. All of those things were given bright terms, but we have to unlearn, you know, and that is where the educational aspect is. We have to unlearn what we were taught, what is planted in the books to keep us away from what really is. Another fable is historically, Papa, when we tell people, made from Timbuktu. The reference to Timbuktu had nothing to do with the fact that Timbuktu is a burial ground of books and knowledge.
But you see, the problem early is this. It is a question again of research. You see, because Timbuktu was always in our consciousness. You see, it was always there. They say, we say Timbuktu, but it was given a negative by the colonizers, so we assumed it and we embraced it. But in fact, the truth was always there. The greatest sense of intelligence, Timbuktu. You see, only now we're discovering that. But my grandmother, my great grandmother, we say sorry, Timbuktu. You see, so the concept was there, and that's why the research is so important, because you see, the reality is there. You know, it's all there. But if you don't plumb it, if you don't discover it, then you'll just be like casting pearls before swine.
Let's look at two others, Papa. Neg Gine, Neg Maon.
Precise.
Go through that for us.
Precise. Again, the same thing too. We say Neg Maon. For us, that was negative. But of course, we know that the Negma were the liberators. they were the cause of emancipation. If there were no Negma, there would be no emancipation. You see? So when Mike wrote his book on Negma, and he explained that the whole struggle of the people who refused to be subjugated, and therefore the people to abandon, going to the hills, with all the negatives that were associated with the hills, because they put snakes and all of these things, like that blessing, so to keep them away from the hills. But they still went, And it's all around. You take, for example, we talk about the indigenous people. The names are right there in the region. In Grenada, for example, a place like Sotes. Sotes. What does Sotes mean? Sotes is just a village. But hello, Sotes is the greatest act of resistance of a people who say, you will not take my body, you will not take my spirit. I prefer to go down. I
jump
will
over the cliff, jump to the death.
To my death. So this is the power of resilience and defiance, and you cannot conquer me. But all of those things, we have them around us, but we don't have the interpretation, the understanding of that, you see. And another point is our brother made a while ago, which I think is important. I would like to raise that.
Before you forget it, you got it? I would say Negine Foaso. The connection between Negine and Foaso.
You see, I mean, the Negine were Guinea people.
Guinea is Guinea.
Guinea. You see? So it's already saying to us, hello, you're talking about people, they identify the local, the place where they came from. And therefore they come from this place where, in fact, in St. Lucia, this is where we can see that history, their culture, they brought it right here, and they continue to pass it on to us. So it's amazing the kind of connections. The point I didn't want to lose really important, that our brother made the point about like at Junior Creole and so forth. You see,
Junior Creole just like Carnival.
Yeah. You see, the issue is this, that we've gotten into what's called an events mode, rather than process. And you see, emancipation, liberation, proper education, reparation, these are not events. This is a process. So people feel, we're going to have an event, so we're going to have a big day, we're going to have a big fete, and then tomorrow we're going to forget it. It's done. Misunderstanding of what we're dealing with. The reality we're dealing with is that we're dealing with a process of self-discovery, a process of liberation, and that process will invite moments when we celebrate, moments when we have events. But those events are coming out of that.
What's important is what happened between the events.
What is ongoing, of which the events are just high points. That is very important, and we don't have that. This is why, for example, you see people plan, say, okay, so we'll plan for celebrating emancipation, celebration of emancipation for 3 years. Emancipation is an ongoing process. You can't plan to celebrate for 3 years. You have to look at what are the issues, what are the strategies we will do for continued emancipation, of which, when moments come, we will highlight.
Ethan, we got from you that you already had and still have your own love for history. And what would you say to fellow students watching and saying, well, I don't have no love for history because it will bring no money in my pocket?
Right, yeah.
How would you discuss that with a fellow student?
I think it's important not to dismiss that concern, because that is a big concern. If you try to specialize in history, there's not the lifestyle that young people want of the riches and stuff. That's not really likely through history, but directly through history. But what that really got me was documentaries and seeing how I could better my thinking, and that applies in all areas of life, where you could think critically, draw from conclusions from the past, take from the future. So in a sense that you should study history because it's a subject that you can develop your thinking, develop how you speak, how you articulate. And a lot of people want to, read and present well. That's a very good way to do that too. And directly, I think Nkrumah, Mr. Lucian, mentioned that economics was a good avenue for that. I also study economics at the college, at the South Lucia College, and that have been a really, really practical way so I can apply economics to and how incentives drive mass behavior in society, and how supply demand, how people react to money, and we could always say that, well, that's just the past and whatever, but in a sense that we should actually link the past, future, present, and we could make a society that's better. And one other thing was that national identity. You were speaking to, we don't know the context around what we was going to, like Negma War and stuff. The identity that if you had an identity studying for history right now, we would be like, okay, I want to be a Negma because that's emancipation, and to be a person that's strong and that stands against the system. And it's not that students or young people are afraid of championing the movement, such as climate change and mental health and all this kind of thing. People are wanting to come behind something that explains them. So if you could kind of increase awareness of emancipation, then we could take over the world.
There was a movement to, there was a suggestion, which of course the University of the West Indies had to drop because there was not sufficient support for it, but it featured in the move to try to save history as a curriculum subject, because there was a move to erase history from the curriculum because not enough students wanted to do history. And as a consequence of that, historians were suggesting that history should be made compulsory. Let's start with you, Dylan.
Perhaps before you
Papa.
before you go on that,
Mm-hmm.
and Nkrumah might be, I was thinking, you see, there was a time when, for example, when a student did the arts,
Mm-hmm.
it was a big thing. Because in those days, you did the arts because you wanted to become a doctor, a lawyer, and so forth. Then came a moment when societies realized that, in fact, we needed to get people into technology, science, and this kind of thing like that. So now the arts became a less important concern because people were all moving to science, into sort of
STEM.
STEM and that. Perhaps we need to find a way in which we can get people to understand history within that same framework, to understand everything is somehow undergirded by your understanding of history. And perhaps that, in Nkrumah, just
The history of the subject.
The way in which we can give back history, its place where
In the curriculum. Yes,
curriculum.
And
Yeah,
Nkrumah?
I think it has to, I totally agree with Papa. It has to do with, I think, the way we understand our issues as well. Many issues, we treat them as if they are just current and don't have a historical basis. So I think if we begin to understand ourselves and our issues in our society with that context, then we will see the value of history and the contribution that students, for instance, who study history, actually make. We have certain conceptions of ourselves, and therefore it's not seen as necessary at all to look back into the past. And we may very well have room for persons to go in and do that. But I also want to say too, that even as we change from the arts to the science to the business and now to things like information technology, there should be at base still an idea of what kind of citizen do we want to engender in our society? What kind of awareness should our citizens have? I remember there's a saying that was given once where an axe was walking into the forest, and some of the trees accepted it because of course the handle of the axe is made out of wood. But without the idea, without understanding, hey, he looks like us, but he's not necessarily for us. History gives you that perspective. So in terms of making it compulsory, on a personal standpoint, I would lean more towards inspiring that interest and developing that appreciation. But I also think very early in the educational career of students, prior to them do go into that selection process, that a lot more needs to be done so that they can make the connection with history, their lives, and the various subjects that they do. You know, from mathematics, all of those things can be connected to it. So then their conception of the education itself changes, that it's not just, hey, I'm just going to fit myself somewhere just to make some money, but that I'm actually coming with a certain consciousness and awareness of the world that will allow me to see things in a particular way, to make sense of certain things, etc. So yeah, I think a lot more work needs to be done that way in the education system and also within our government system as well, that we understand ourselves with the historical context.
I do agree with Mr. Lucian. However, going back to, if you don't mind, gentlemen, going back to the economy and history, there is money being made in St. Lucia because of history. Take a walk to the south of the island. Come to Soufrière. Let's look at the baths that were built by King Louis at the Diamond Falls. Let us look at so many trails, historical trails. As a matter of fact, I heard of a new trail that is being opened in Fondou, a historical trail. And I feel to some extent that the tourists now have become more knowledgeable about history than we, to some extent, you know. But at the end of the day, I'm just saying that to show that the connection between history and making a dollar out of it and showing it to not just to our people, but the tourists and anybody else who comes and wants to learn. Now, as for the question you asked, Mr. Bousquet, with history being made compulsory at schools, that would depend on whether, maybe up to a certain grade, I would say up to a certain grade, that students should learn in the first few grades and maybe up to Form 3 about history. And after this, we can allow the student to choose whatever
to make
subject.
their choice.
I think it was like that in the past. I'm not too sure it's still this way, but okay, very well. So that is how I see it.
Ethan?
Well, when you force something on people, that's never a good way to try and make people to learn and change their behavior. But I still think that it could be encouraged at the lower levels and not through reading and not through random facts. And that's how I remember them teaching us history and our surroundings is through random facts, and we have to, it's not in context and we have no importance to why we're learning that too. But if we could, you know, I'm a big advocate for, you know, just letting the children just go online and search, like, you supervise them by, like, say, what is reparations? And they go, and you see them read, and they will just, and the way the system works, it will lead them into deeper rabbit holes and lead them to understand and answer questions that are put into them. Also, documentaries. I love documentaries. And it doesn't have to be some Netflix documentary. You can go on YouTube and search Oversimplified. That's one of the YouTube channels that talks about history and world history. But to force it, that's a hard sell to anybody.
Although I think those who propose making it mandatory or compulsory did not have the idea of forcing, and even if it can be described and defined as not allowing somebody to make a voluntary choice, the argument here is taking a decision in your interest to introduce you to something that is important for you from the standpoint that a human or a person without knowledge of their history is like a tree without its roots. I think if there was to be a referendum on whether we should pursue reparations, we would not have been where we are. The decision was taken on our behalf by governments in our interest. And I think it is in that context that those who are proposing making history mandatory, compulsory, or by whatever word, the intent was not to force it, but to make it necessary for us to learn, well, not us, but for the present generation and future generations to learn about ourselves at school. Would you see it in that context? Yes, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I want to just interject that even in terms of like, when we look at education, we think of the students sitting in the class. And I do agree with the point that you're making with regard to, hey, our citizens need to learn certain things. And perhaps it can be thought of beyond just the classroom and the syllabus, because even within that context, we have limitations in that we teach a CXC syllabus, and we make our attempts to fit St. Lucia into it. And there are aspects that are just difficult to fit into it. So again, if we look at education on a wider level, here we are on the National Television Network. We know there are a lot of resources that are produced that can help to inform the general public, because remember, it's not just the young persons who really have to be educated, but even our adults need to be re-educated and further educated. So from that wider standpoint, it is quite possible to make, for instance, the general awareness of the public informed of certain things, historical, through various avenues. FRC continues to do that kind of work. For instance, with the current executive director, I am seeing the various posts coming out informing of various things. So that is another approach that can be used in terms of ensuring that the population is aware of certain things, can tap into historical knowledge in analyzing certain things. So the classroom, yes, is one setting where it can be done, but we have a lot of avenues now beyond that can be tapped into to inform and engage the population and the young persons at all about those things.
Dylan?
Yes.
Yeah, in the meantime, folks, Monsignor Anthony has had to slip out of our conversation by prior engagement, and he and I also have another engagement. We call today Zoom Day because of the amount of Zooms we've had to be doing from morning. But it's International Youth Day, and you are watching our discussion around the semicircle, our conversation on youth, student, and reparations. And we have 5 minutes left in today's program, and during those 5 minutes, I'd like us to go around the table and go around the table online and come to some final remarks on how we feel and where we would like to see youth, students, and reparations after International Youth Day 2023. Let's start with you, Ethan.
Well, youth, in a sense, I would love to see that people actually take the issues that affect them. We adopt a lot of international mentalities in the Caribbean, and if we could champion the same way that we champion other issues, the issue of reparations and colorism, racism within the Caribbean region, and I think we could actually develop a sense of identity, and a national identity, a Caribbean identity, and that would be awesome.
Thank you. And a youth perspective, Dylan?
Well, I would like to encourage our young people in St. Lucia to study repatriation, study your culture. It did not happen to us, it did not happen to you, but it is not so far. Just about 100 years ago, your great-grandparents, your grandparents, you should at least try to find out what happened, how they survived, how they were treated. These are our people. What happened to the indigenous people that were on the island before the slaves arrived, before the Europeans arrived? Take a walk to Soufrière. Go to Fonjalib. How many of our people know where Fonjalib is, what Fonjalib even means? Guerrilla warfare, the battle at Rabat. We are not aware of these things. And it's very sad. So I am hoping, Mr. Bousquet, that we will continue, programs such as this, where we can edify our young people, teach them, let them know how important it is, and at least they can get some gist that they will be able to go and do their own research. The brother a while ago before spoke about doing active research. He did a lot of active research. So after this program, do not just stay and discuss or speak only on what you've heard, but go back and do some active research, learn, and then spread the word.
And Kruba?
All right, great. I want to say two things. One, I agree with everything Mr. Emmanuel mentioned, but I also want to say that while the actual enslavement didn't happen to us, we should also understand that we are actually still experiencing some of the effects of that attitude towards color, towards hair, towards language. And even our ignorance of some of those things impacts us too. Finally, I want to say that young persons raise some of the most pressing questions now, and it would benefit both them and older generations to engage on those issues. So young persons, the urgency, and older persons, the context. And the National Reparations Committee, we are present on Facebook. I would encourage persons to go check out our page, St. Lucia National Reparations Committee. And you can look out for us on other social media platforms later on in the year. But it is a platform that we use to engage issues. We have in our album section various resources, books that persons can check out to better inform themselves. So I encourage young persons and old to like our page, follow it, raise questions, discuss, etc., so that we can take the discussion and the awareness forward. Thank you.
And of course, one of the underlying messages from today's discussion, from today's conversation, is that we do not see reparations only as an event, but what is important is what happens between the celebratory events. And therefore, it is in that context we hope that we have been able to convince those of you watching today on International Youth Day of the importance of youth and students engaging in learning more about and being part of the Caribbean reparation movement, which has gone global by not just participating and learning more, but also trying to encourage other youth and students who aren't yet on that journey to join with them, if only starting with the possibility of securing scholarships on reparations, which are available, like I said earlier, from the University of the West Indies and the University of Cambridge, but also there are other possibilities of engagement in academic approaches to reparations, because the struggle has to be carried on all fronts. On behalf of the team here at NTN, on behalf of the Cultural Development Foundation, on behalf of the National Reparations Committee, National Youth Council, National Students Council, and all the stakeholders involved in ensuring that Emancipation Month 2023 is a success. I'm Earl Bousquet saying thanks for viewing, and stay tuned for our next discussion. Thank you for watching.